So, I've mentioned this in videos before, but I've never gone into a lot of detail. There are two ways that you can get a book published today. You can send out about 100 query letters to a traditional publisher, or you can self-publish through a website like Amazon. And you should skip the traditional publishers already and just go through Amazon. Video over. Okay, let me explain. First, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I occasionally run into people who still insist that traditional publishing is still the way to go. Or at the very least, they list the pros of traditional publishing versus self-publishing. Traditional publishers have historically covered the bulk of costs regarding editing, cover design, and especially marketing. This is because a traditional publisher makes money when the book sells. They can't make a profit until that happens, and so they have a vested interest in using their much larger supply of resources to take care of these issues. Sometimes they'll even try to find a movie deal for you if they have a clause in their contract that nets them a cut. There are two groups of people I know who are still promoting traditional publishing. First, there are the authors who are already traditionally published and have a reliable, established platform and can get a deal easily. And then there are the people who aren't involved in publishing books at all, and they just know that when they see a familiar trademark like Penguin Books on the cover, they feel like it's trustworthy. And that's another primary benefit of traditional publishing that people will usually list. The publishing houses have a seal of approval that they stamp your book with, and for a lot of people, that matters. Now, the people that I know of who are already established authors who went through traditional publishing, they're all fairly old. At the very least, none of them are younger than 50. And they got their first book published at least 20 years ago. And what's important to realize is that they got their foot in the door before self-publishing was a viable option. And I think what these authors are trying to do is they're trying to get aspiring authors to avoid self-publishing, only to not sell a single copy of their books because they don't understand the marketing and business side of being an author, which self-publishing requires you to do. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. The only problem with this is that today, traditional publishing houses don't do these things anymore. At least, not until after you've already done them yourself. If you're trying to get a deal with a publishing house and you don't already have an established platform or connections, your odds of getting any kind of deal are next to zero. They're not absolutely zero, obviously, but they're darn close. If a publishing house is going to consider a deal for your book, they want to know that it's a sure thing. And rather than do that the old way by reading your book, determining if it was any good, using the skills they used to have in these publishing companies to find the right way to market it, or things that need to be changed in order to make it more appropriate for the right audience today, they just want you to already have your own following, usually on YouTube or Twitter or some other social media. The idea here is that you need to already have an audience that wants to buy your book before the company publishes your book. You might already notice two major problems with this. First, it almost relies on you already having the book published in order for the publisher to offer you a publishing deal. And second, it requires you to do all the social media, networking, and in a lot of ways the marketing and advertising that the publishing company is supposed to do. So, what do you need the publisher for? Now, I understand completely why older, well-established authors would keep promoting traditional publishing. Because if you're like Stephen King, or even more recently Rick Riordan, you already have an established audience and platform. And because it worked for you, you might assume it will work for new authors. And the burdens of the business side of being an author are great, make no mistake. Most authors are not cut out to handle this side of things. I'm not even sure if I can say that I'm cut out for it, and I've been at it for almost 3 years now. So if you know for a fact that most authors can't market their own work, and you found a way to sell your books that worked for you, it makes sense to promote traditional publishing. But it's a bit like you hopped on the last lifeboat and are now wondering why people who are still on the sinking ship are trying to grab life preservers and are swimming to shore. Now, to understand why the publishing industry is like this, I need to go over some old ground. I've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. Partly because I know most people don't watch all of my videos, and also because recently I saw another video about fantasy where someone in the comments section had wrote, "Literature is dead because we let women take it over." Now, I get that broad strokes paint the fence faster, but this is one of those times when we really need to pick the problem apart. As I've said in previous videos, the staff at the big 5 publishing houses are all overwhelmingly women from wealthy backgrounds. This is because they are all located in New York City, one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in, and in one of the pricier parts of the city at that. And they only hire people who go through their unpaid internship program first. The only people who can afford to live in New York City with no pay for an internship are women with rich parents. And mostly, we're talking about Protestant and Jewish families, two American cultures who might pay for their daughters to do this sort of thing, but not a son. If you're a Nepo baby in either a rich Protestant family or a rich Jewish family, and you're a guy, they expect you to join the family business. Or at least join something similar, like a different branch of the law if the family is full of lawyers. Sons of the family aren't usually given lots of money just so they can run off and join some other company in pursuit of a completely different career. This is why the traditional publishing industry has become almost exclusively women. But more to the point, it's all Nepo babies. And this is part of the reason why I hate unpaid internships. Most people cannot realistically afford to work for free. And when you place them in one of the highest cost of living areas in the country, you're basically screening out everyone except the Nepo babies. Now I know why companies do this. They're effectively outsourcing a massive chunk of their staffing costs to the parents of their own employees. Having to pay each of their editors, publishers, and other employees a living wage would be expensive, and this method shaves off a lot of overhead costs. But the companies are getting exactly what they're paying for, and the big five publishers are now staffed almost entirely with some of the most incompetent, spoiled, adult children you could imagine. None of them were hired on their ability to judge what books the companies should publish and promote, or their ability to market new stories. Heck, most of them weren't even hired on DEI standards, and in this industry, even that would be an improvement. While there might be a few exceptions here and there, the majority of the people now working in many of these companies have no real interest in doing the actual job of being a publisher. They just like the idea of being a publisher. And the key thing is that making a deal with a new author is a gamble for a publishing company. The only way that they can hedge their bets and win that gamble is by reading the books people have to offer and selectively deciding who they offer a deal. Which means actually reading these stories and deciding if they are actually marketable. Which takes work, which many of these Nepo babies don't even know how to do. And publishing books by established authors who already have an audience doesn't take any work at all. And hey, there are all these authors making their own YouTube channels, marketing their own books, getting out there and building up a platform. So why can't you all just do that? Notice how none of these problems have anything to do with the fact that they're all women. I mean, they are all women, because they primarily came from families that weren't going to buy their sons a job like this, but that has nothing to do with the problem of marketing. So, one of the two biggest reasons to go the traditional publisher route, which is having the publisher do the marketing and business side for you, is basically gone. Because the people working for these companies are either too incompetent or too lazy to do it anymore. But the other reason why so many older authors think traditional publishing is still the way to go is because getting your book published traditionally comes with their seal of approval. Having their logo on one of your books is supposed to be a mark of quality, right? Well, yeah, if they're only publishing quality books. And the market isn't slowly being overtaken by authors who had to self-publish because the traditional companies wouldn't cut them a deal. This is the part where the fact that these companies are all women actually does become a problem. First, a publishing company that's exclusively women is going to have many of the same problems as a company that's all men. You know why Harry Potter was a boy, when J.K. Rowling admitted that she would have rather written her story with a female protagonist? Well, it was because that was what she had to do at the time to get her book published. When you get an entire industry where everyone has at least one demographic in common with no one outside of that demographic, certain biases are going to be carried over and end up being woven into the industry. And that's just as true for an all-female industry as it is when it's all-male. I wasn't joking when I said that it would be better if they hired people on DEI standards, because this is one of those rare cases where hiring people based on their background, and by extension their personal tastes, would actually improve the publishing industry. At least compared to what it is now, because then there'd be a wider variety of books that can be published. Instead, the traditional publishing industry is filled almost entirely with women from an incredibly privileged upbringing. And worst of all, they're the kind of women who like to think of themselves as strong, independent career women, but because nothing could be further from the truth, they try to actively avoid thinking about how they got these jobs in the first place. So, you have a whole industry full of hyper-privileged women who don't really want to think too much, or they'll risk thinking about things they don't want to think about, and they're working in an industry where they're supposed to be reading books, which, as a medium, require you to think more than any other method of storytelling. But on top of that, One of the major disadvantages of traditional publishing is that you are selling the IP rights to your book to the company, and they can change the story within the confines of their contract. While this is meant to be for the purposes of editing, in some cases, they've rewritten the story entirely to meet the biases of the publishing house. There have been lawsuits over this, but the one area of employment that the companies never seem to skimp on are the IP lawyers. Basically, if they like the ideas behind your IP enough to work with the world building, or the characters, or something else, but they want to inject their own politics or their own message, or just change things they don't like for personal reasons, all of this falls into the concept of editing, since there's always a legal case that can be made that these changes will make your story more marketable for some group of people, usually at the expense of marketing it to a different group of people. You might notice a major conflict here with the idea that you have to try and garner your own audience before you can even get a deal, and then they're going to change their book in such a way that it's not going to be marketable to that very same audience. Meanwhile, every story that falls into a genre more popular among women is going to get some serious editing that no self-respecting author would ever agree to. Every fantasy story has to have a romance, especially stories aimed at the YA audience. And with those romances, I get that it can be either a struggle or a laugh fest reading men trying to write about women, but it turns out women are just as bad at writing about men. And there's no opting out of these kinds of edits either. The publishing house presents you with a contract, and the clause allowing them to cut your intellectual property to shreds, because you won't own it anymore once you sign the dotted line. That clause is a take it or leave it kind of deal. And the publishing houses know that you've already tried everything you could to get this one offer from one house, and yet you don't even know if you'll ever get another one. The companies know full well they've got you over a barrel. Or at least, they do if you only consider traditional publishing a valid option. Once you sign that contract, you own none of the manuscript rights. They can overhaul the entire story if they want to, and turn the entire premise, the themes, the morals, all of it upside down. And your name, unless you used a pen name, will still be on the cover, attached to whatever pile of slop they turned your work into. Now, I've never heard of men complaining about working in an all-male workplace. On the other hand, I've heard a lot of women complaining about working in an all-female workplace. There does seem to be something to the idea that men have an easier time identifying with a character's struggle and perseverance, while women have an easier time identifying with a character that looks exactly like her. The result in all of this is the reason why the YA section keeps becoming more and more populated by romance novels masquerading as action-adventure. Every female protagonist has to be really close to, if not cross over the line into a Mary Sue, and the stories seem to be less focused on the actual events of the story, and more about how the characters feel about them. One of the reasons why I started writing was because I was bored with my options at the local bookstores, and because I knew I wasn't the only one. And it was my younger cousin who told me he didn't like reading and thought that reading was for girls that made me first realize the problem. Because when I tried taking him into a Barnes & Noble to prove that no, reading was not just for girls, I was quickly defeated by shelf after shelf containing nothing but teenage romance novels, which were written from a female perspective, with insane, clumsily written, borderline psychopathic boys as love interests. But by the time I finished the first draft of my novel, I already knew that it would never be published in a traditional publishing company. If you've read Heroes of Janan, you might already know why. This is the sort of book that these companies would be interested in when they looked at the front cover, and they'd love the idea of a Middle Eastern steampunk fantasy, but as soon as they discovered it didn't line up with the popular ideologies of the day, or that the characters come in a wide variety of flavors, with the girls each having strengths and flaws that are unique to their own backgrounds, instead of having exactly the same personalities as nearly every character in traditionally published literature today, they'd either toss the book aside or make me an offer and then tear it to shreds in the editing room. I have encountered more than enough writing groups which were run by women from nearly the same backgrounds as the ones working in the Big Five today. Some of them even used to work in some of these publishing houses before they were let go for reasons that we won't get into. And the most common question they asked about my writing was always something in the format of, can you take the traits that I think are positive and put them on all the characters whose demographics I like? And can you take all the traits that I think are negative and put them on the characters with demographics that I don't like? These are the sorts of people who will tear apart your manuscript today, all under the guise of editing your work to improve it for sales, or whatever other excuse they come up with. Now, one way that I know people are trying to get their books traditionally published is by attaching another big name author to their work. James Patterson and Rick Riordan will both put their names on another author's book so as to give the new author credibility. This is one way that you can try to get traditionally published if you can get into contact with these authors. But if you actually check the reviews of these books with Rick Riordan Presents on the cover, you might notice a problem. Part of why people loved The Lightning Thief when it first came out was because it was primarily focused on issues teenagers will face behind a backdrop of mythological figures. Demigods all have ADHD and dyslexia because Riordan's son had both of those conditions, and he wrote the book specifically as a love letter to his kid. There was no obsession over issues like politics, global warming, or colonialism, which teenagers do not really care about. Some of them pretend they do because they're trying to find their personalities or look cool and important, but that's not the same. I know that Riordan included LGBTQWASF alphabet soup issues in some of his later books like the Apollo Trials, but I can lump that in as another issue kids actually do have to deal with at this age. When the top review on Amazon for Fury of the Dragon Goddess says, Chada excels in this action-packed adventure peppered with scenes examining Western theft of cultural artifacts, xenophobia, and Islamophobia, you know this book isn't meant for its own target audience. And I never see any of the people who enjoyed the Percy Jackson series taking any interest in any of these new works. And while I'm certain all of the new authors with Rick Riordan Presents on the cover are not overtly political, a few bad apples spoil the bunch. And the fact that a publishing company might publish a book with Rick Riordan's name on it doesn't make it good. And people are noticing. And the worst part is, I don't even know if the politics were deliberate by the author or forcibly inserted during the editing process by the Disney Hyperion Publishing Company. And with James Patterson, well, he was never good to begin with. Partly because he wrote an entire series about genetically engineered bird people who were going to save the world from global warming by eating their own weight in meat every day. Yeah, I have no idea how that's supposed to work. So for the publishing houses, choosing to give deals to new writers because another successful author already got a deal is starting to tank their reputation. The logo of the Big Five isn't going to carry as much weight as it used to. It still matters for a lot of older readers, who are probably used to actively looking for it as proof that the book is actually good. But if your target audience is younger than 30, it's not going to make a difference to them if your book was traditionally published or not. Oh, and you know that Riordan, Peterson, and these other big-name authors aren't putting their names on these books for free. Remember that if you publish traditionally, the publishing house is already going to take anywhere between 80 and 90% of the sale price of the book as part of their deal. If you have to give another 5% to a more established author just to get your foot in the door, you'd better be ready for the starving part of being an artist. And that's the ultimate problem. Is all of this worth it? Even if you somehow make it work, if you manage to get a deal, and you're okay with them carving up your book like a turkey in the editing process, just to get 10% of the book sales before taxes? If you have to do the marketing and legwork to get your book in stores by yourself anyway, and the publisher's logo doesn't carry the same seal of approval that it used to, what do you even need them for anyway? Are there still ways to make traditional publishing work? Yes, there are. But the benefits of traditional publishing keep disappearing, while the downsides either stay the same or are getting worse. Self-publishing is undeniably the way of the future. And this is the part of the video where I plug my own novel. Heroes of Janan, The Science of Magic is the first in a series set in a Middle Eastern steampunk fantasy world with Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythology. You can get it on Amazon, and stay posted, because the next book in the series is almost finished and will be out soon. I'm also planning on going on a research trip soon, and will be using that time to pin down some of the facts for my upcoming video on Lilith. But I will have to take some time off during the month of October. Finally, today's featured video game is none other than Core Keeper. Yes, I am aware that the game has been out on early access for some time now, but the final game has only been out for a few weeks. And to be frank, I don't think it's gotten the attention it deserves. Core Keeper is a top-down crafting game, somewhere in the same vein as Terraria, but from a different angle. You find a strange object in the wilderness one day, you touch it, and you wake up in the underground near a large round object called the Core. The gameplay is nothing really to write home about. It's pretty straightforward. But the ambiance, the environment, the music, the things you can discover, those are all where the game really shines. There's never been a game that made me feel more like I'm in a Studio Ghibli movie. And that's partly because there actually are references to Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, but it goes much further than that. The big mystery, which I haven't played enough of the game to solve yet, is figuring out what the core of the game is named after really is, and learning more about the civilization that used to be down here. What are the cavelings? Are they humans who've been down here so long that they've devolved into primitives? Are they some kind of space aliens? A pre-human civilization? Something else altogether? We don't know yet. This game is best played with friends and family. I don't recommend playing it alone very much, and I'm hoping they keep making updates so we can get some more answers. Or that some YouTube channel dedicated to unraveling video game lore mysteries will give this one a crack. Alright, that's all for today, folks. Thank you all, and goodbye.